Today, we dive into the Everest climb, where a couple took a cute photo, and they died after. Love and obsession led them to treat the highest point on Earth like a photo opportunity, and they dismissed their Sherpa's pleas to descend. This resulted in one reckless decision that forever changed the lives of everyone present on the mountain. It was April 16, 2016, and Everest Base Camp at 17,600 feet sprawled across the Khumbu Glacier in the organized chaos of a full spring season. 14 commercial expeditions occupied the broken ice shelf, tents clustered by company on flattened rubble platforms that shifted and groaned as the glacier moved beneath them. Prayer flags snapped in wind that carried juniper smoke and the sharp smell of glacial ice. Temperatures hovered near 20 degrees at dawn, climbing into the low 30s by midday. Generators hummed from mess tents while radios crackled with weather fragments that changed daily. It was early in the season, and the mountain above camp looked impossibly large. The western CWM, the Lhotse Face, the South Col, and the Summit Pyramid stacked in vertical succession like stages of a problem that only got harder. Among the climbers settling into acclimatization were Nathan and Sophie Keller, a married couple from Boulder, Colorado, who had spent 5 years building toward this expedition. Nathan was 34, a project manager for a civil engineering firm who had turned serious about mountaineering 8 years earlier after a guided trek in Peru left him unable to stop thinking about peaks. His resume had grown methodically. Denali via the West Buttress, Aconcagua via the normal route, Ama Dablam via the Southwest Ridge at 22,349 feet, and Island Peak. Ama Dablam had given him legitimate technical experience at altitude, the kind of climbing that required ice tools, fixed ropes, and comfort on exposed terrain where a fall meant death. He was fit, well-researched, and organized to the point where his gear spreadsheets had revision history. Sophie was 31. A graphic designer who had followed Nathan into climbing after they summited Kilimanjaro together on their honeymoon. She'd gone on to climb Mount Rainier via the Disappointment Cleaver, learning basic crampon technique and rope travel beforehand. Her mountaineering resume was thin for Everest, thinner than most operators would accept, but her endurance base was genuine. Multiple 50-mile ultra-marathons and year-round altitude training in Colorado. The expedition operator weighed her cardiovascular fitness and Nathan's experience as mitigating factors when accepting her application, with the understanding that she would climb with dedicated Sherpa support and supplemental oxygen from Camp 4. The expedition cost $130,000 combined, $65,000 each, for a reputable mid-range operator running small teams with experienced Sherpa staff. They weren't wealthy. The money came from 3 years of saving, a cashed-out investment account, and the kind of financial commitment that only made sense if you believed the experience justified the debt that followed. Everest had started as Nathan's dream, but became theirs somewhere between Kilimanjaro's summit and the training that followed. Sophie had pitched the summit photo, not for social media or sponsorships, but as something personal. The two of them on the highest point on Earth, faces visible, prayer flags behind them. She posted about the climb to roughly 8,000 Instagram followers, but she wasn't an influencer and never described the expedition in commercial terms. The photo mattered because of what it represented to them, not what it would generate online. Their primary Sherpa guide was Karsang Thendu, 42, from Tame Village in the Khumbu, 14 Everest summits across 19 seasons. A career built on patience, consistency, and conservative judgment that kept clients alive in an industry where aggression often proved fatal. He was not a talker. He observed, assessed, and spoke when something mattered, and when he did, experienced operators listened. He supported a wife, 2 daughters, and a nephew taken in after the boy's father died in an avalanche on Manaslu. His reputation rested on 0 client fatalities in 14 years of guiding. Not a statistic to him, but proof the work was being done the way it should be. Karsang met Nathan and Sophie during the first team briefing, where the expedition leader, an American guide named Robert Marsh, outlined the route, acclimatization plan, and objective hazards. Nathan asked detailed questions about rope fixing progress and forecast sources. Sophie's questions revealed less depth, tent assignment, phone charging. The gap between their preparation was subtle, but visible to someone who had spent 2 decades reading clients. During a rest day at Camp 2, Sophie mentioned the summit photo to Karsang, what it would mean, the framing she'd imagined, the prayer flags she hoped would be in the background. Karsang's response was practical and kind. Summit time was limited. Conditions dictated everything. He would take the photo when the moment was right, but only after safety checks and only if time allowed. Sophie agreed easily, thanking him with the warmth that characterized most of her interactions at camp. It was a small conversation, neither treated as significant. Karsang filed it as a detail. Sophie filed it as a promise the mountain would keep. The first rotation through the icefall to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet established the pattern that would define the expedition. Nathan moved steadily, his crampon work clean on ladders and ice. Sophie was slower, her breathing labored on the steeper sections, her pace dropping in the final hour as altitude pressed down on effort that would have felt routine at sea level. They arrived behind schedule, the last team in, Nathan having slowed to stay beside her. The partnership was genuine, but costly. Every minute Sophie needed, Nathan gave, which meant both of them operated with less margin than they should have carried. The second rotation to Camp 2 at 21,200 feet through the western CWM hit harder. The CWM functioned as a solar heat trap once the sun cleared the ridgelines, reflecting light from every surface until air temperatures climbed into the 40s, despite the altitude. Sophie's pace dropped to short bursts, followed by extended rest breaks, her breathing rapid and shallow even during pauses. Ultramarathon endurance did not translate to altitude performance, and the gap was becoming difficult to ignore. Her oxygen saturation at Camp 2 read 73% unmasked. Nathan's read 78, both acceptable, but Sophie's was lower than Karsang preferred at this stage. He noted the number without comment, understanding that early rotations didn't always predict final outcome. The third rotation to Camp 3 at 23,500 feet on the Lhasa face exposed the full scope of the problem. The route climbed a wall of blue ice angled between 40 and 50 degrees, fixed ropes providing security, while crampons demanded sustained precision. That altitude steadily eroded. Sophie's technique was functional, but wasteful. Too much lateral motion, overcorrections on traverses, energy burn that stronger climbers conserved through economy of movement. She required 7 hours for a climb most capable clients completed in 5. At Camp 3, her saturation read 68%. Nathan's read 72. The numbers were trending in the wrong direction. Karsang raised concerns with Marsh. Sophie's saturations were declining rather than improving. Her pace was consistently below the minimum he considered safe for summit logistics, and her skills deteriorated under fatigue instead of stabilizing. Marsh reviewed the data and spoke with both of them at base camp. Sophie's numbers fell in the gray zone, concerning but not disqualifying, especially with supplemental oxygen on summit day. The decision was theirs. The risks were real. Karsang's judgment on the mountain was final. Both acknowledged the terms with the seriousness the conversation required and the confidence of people who believed the worst outcomes applied to other climbers. The weather window arrived in late May. Forecasts predicted 36 to 48 hours of reduced winds beginning May 21st, and teams across base camp mobilized. Nathan and Sophie joined without hesitation. Marsh cleared them with the standing condition that Karsang held turnaround authority. The climb through lower camps took 3 days, slow, methodical, uneventful. They reached Camp 4 on the South Col at 26,000 feet on the afternoon of May 21st, a barren, wind-blasted shelf of ice and rock at the threshold of the death zone, where the body deteriorated faster than it could recover. Tents shuddered in gusts that poured over the col from the west, and the air was thin enough that even simple tasks required concentration disproportionate to the action. Karsang checked vitals with masks removed, measuring baseline acclimatization without supplemental boost. Nathan's unmasked resting saturation, 66%, low, but within the range where bottled oxygen would bring him into functional territory. Sophie's, 61%. Worse than Karsang had expected. He explained what the reading meant directly. Her body was not processing oxygen adequately at this altitude. The summit was 3,000 vertical feet above them, and every foot gained would reduce available oxygen further. Supplemental flow would help, but her baseline suggested it might not compensate enough at the altitudes they'd be climbing through. He recommended she descend. Sophie's response was immediate. She had invested 5 years and everything they had saved. Nathan initially echoed Karsang's concern, his voice carrying the careful tone of someone balancing honesty with loyalty. But Sophie made clear that if she descended, both descended, neither summited. The equation was simple and absolute in the way that only deeply personal commitments could be. Karsang radioed Marsh. The expedition leader spoke with them via radio, heard Sophie's insistence, and reiterated the framework that governed every commercial Everest operation. The decision to climb was the client's, the decision to turn around was the guide's, and Karsang's real-time judgment was final. He did not overrule the attempt, but placed the weight where it always landed, on the Sherpa standing next to them when the numbers stopped being abstract. With masks sealed at 2 liters per minute for rest, Sophie's saturation climbed to the low 70s. Nathan's reached mid-70s, marginal but within range. Karsang set the climbing plan. Nathan at 3 liters per minute, Sophie at 4, the higher rate because her baseline demanded every advantage. The assistant Sherpa would carry reserve bottle. Turnaround time, 11 in the morning, regardless of position. Nathan acknowledged it directly. Sophie nodded. The summit push departed at 10:30 that night, under a sky so clear the stars looked close enough to carry heat. Wind chill pushed -35 degrees Fahrenheit, but the air was calm, and conditions were as close to ideal as Everest offered. The southeast ridge stretched into darkness, headlamp beams from a dozen teams drawing thin lines across the snow above. For the first 2 hours, they held a slow but steady rhythm, supplemental oxygen keeping their legs moving, adrenaline overriding the fatigue accumulated over 3 days of climbing. Other teams moved at their own speed, some faster, some comparable, the mountain absorbing everyone into its scale. Above the balcony at 27,600 feet, the deterioration became visible. Sophie's rest stops stretched from 30 seconds to 2 minutes, then longer. Her steps drifted off the packed boot line into deeper snow that cost more energy per stride. Karsang guided her back repeatedly, hand on her arm, voice steady. Nathan stayed stronger, but was burning reserves matching her pace rather than his own. The same pattern of partnership, now extracting a cost altitude multiplied with every foot gained. The steep snow slope where the old Hillary Step had been, altered by the 2015 earthquake into a less technical but still demanding pitch, required focus Sophie was losing. Her crampon placements became imprecise, front points scraping rather than biting. She caught a point on her gaiter and stumbled forward, catching the fixed rope with a delayed reaction that Karsang noted with quiet alarm. Nathan grabbed her arm. They kept moving, but the pace had slowed to something barely distinguishable from standing still, and the sky above shifted from black to the deep blue that preceded dawn. They reached the summit at approximately 10:20 in the morning, 40 minutes before Karsang's turnaround. The math was deceptive. They had technically made the window, but the margin was gone. Every minute on top was subtracted from a descent they could not afford to extend. The emotion hit before the math did. Sophie was crying behind her oxygen mask, shoulders shaking as she reached for Nathan. He pulled her close. The Himalayas spread beneath them in every direction. Lhotse, Nuptse, Makalu, and peaks beyond naming. The curvature of the atmosphere visible at the horizon. The sky above was darker than skies should be, deepened by altitude into something closer to space than weather. They were standing on the highest point on Earth together, and the moment was everything they had spent 5 years imagining. Karsang gave them a few minutes, standard, even for conservative guides. He took Nathan's camera from the inner pocket, where it had been kept warm against the battery-killing cold, and took a quick photo of the two of them standing together. The image came out functional. 2 figures in down suits and oxygen masks, recognizable, but with faces hidden behind goggles and rubber. Karsang told them it was time to descend. Sophie asked to see the photo. She pushed her goggles up and looked at the small screen. Their faces weren't visible. Goggles and masks obscured everything that made them recognizable as themselves, rather than 2 anonymous figures in identical gear. She asked for one more with goggles up and masks briefly lowered, just long enough for the shutter to catch their actual faces. Nathan agreed immediately. He pulled off his outer mittens to work the camera buttons. Liner gloves only against wind chill that made -35 feel like a number invented to describe a sensation beyond cold. Anne handed the camera to Karsang. Karsang took the second shot. Nathan checked the screen with fingers already losing dexterity, the cold working into his joints faster than he expected. The frame was tilted. His hand had shaken at the wrong moment. One more. Sophie wanted to reposition, so the prayer flags another team had planted were visible in the background. They shifted. Karsang took another. Wind gusted and Sophie's hood blew across half her face. One more. Cold hands created a feedback loop that extended every attempt. Nathan's fingers stiffened with each passing minute, making the small buttons harder to press, causing more failed shots. keeping his hands exposed longer. Sophie's oxygen mask hung below her chin between takes. Supplemental flow interrupted each time, her lungs pulling in air cold enough to damage tissue. Neither registered the accumulating damage. At 29,000 feet, the brain's ability to assess its own impairment was among the first casualties of altitude. The same hypoxia degrading their judgment prevented them from recognizing the degradation. Karsang's warnings shortened as the minutes passed. He told them they needed to leave. He told them the margin was gone. He pointed southwest where clouds were building in formations that 19 seasons of reading Himalayan weather made legible without a forecast. The wind was freshening. Nathan responded with the same phrase each time, delivered with the conviction of someone who believed 30 seconds was still 30 seconds at 29,000 feet. Just one more. Almost done. The delay stretched roughly 25 minutes beyond Karsang's initial call to descend. No single request was unreasonable. No single retake killed them. It was the accumulation, minute stacked on minute at an altitude where the body was dying faster than it could sustain itself, reserves draining through exposed skin and interrupted oxygen, and the simple thermodynamic cost of standing still in the thinnest air on Earth. The delay was the killer. The mask and glove removal made a lethal situation worse, but the situation was already lethal the moment they stopped descending. They began moving down at 1050, every minute of turnaround margin consumed on the summit. The descent started from zero reserve. No buffer, no room for anything to go wrong on a mountain where something always went wrong. Nathan's fingers were white and wooden inside his liner gloves, frostbite establishing itself in tissue that would never recover. He pulled his outer mittens on with teeth and wrists, unable to feel whether they seated properly. The first 30 minutes were controlled but brittle. Nathan led, Sophie behind, Karsang behind Sophie, the assistant at the rear. Nathan's frozen hands made rope work clumsy. He gripped the fixed line with wrists and forearms rather than fingers, a compensation that worked until it wouldn't. Sophie fell apart first and fast. Everything that had been accumulating, 12 hours of climbing, the summit exposure, the oxygen interruptions, the heat loss, converged into a system shutting down rather than a single failure. Her pace dropped to nearly nothing. She stumbled on terrain she'd ascended hours earlier, crampons catching on features her feet no longer had the precision to navigate. Her responses to Karsang arrived late and fragmented. The distance between hearing and understanding stretched beyond what her oxygen-starved brain could bridge. Below the south summit, around 28,500 feet, Sophie sat down without warning. She didn't signal fatigue. She simply lowered herself into the snow, with the slow, deliberate motion of someone whose body had made a decision her mind hadn't been consulted on. Nathan called to her. She responded in fragments, mentioned being tired, said something about the camera that made no contextual sense, then stopped talking. Nathan tried to help her stand. She rose partway, took 3 steps that looked more like controlled falling, and sat again. The pattern repeated twice, each cycle producing less distance and less coherence. By the 3rd attempt, she did not rise at all. Karsang switched her to a fresh oxygen bottle. The flow interruptions at the summit had drained the first faster than planned, but the improvement was negligible. The damage had compounded past what supplemental oxygen could reverse at this altitude. Wind increased. Clouds that had been building to the southwest slid overhead, and the temperature dropped. Spindrift began hissing across the slope, in thin streams that thickened with each gust. Visibility narrowing as the mountain reminded everyone on its upper reaches that weather windows closed on their own schedule. At approximately 28,400 feet, Sophie stopped entirely, seated, clipped to the fixed line, head bowed to her chest, unresponsive to Karsang's voice or his hand on her shoulder. Her breathing came shallow and rapid, each exhale carrying a faint rattle that suggested fluid accumulating in her lungs. Karsang checked her pupils, sluggish. Cerebral edema advanced past the stage where descent alone could reverse it. Nathan refused to leave. Karsang explained it with the directness that mattered above 28,000 feet. Sophie could not walk. They could not carry her, and every minute they remained increased the probability that all of them died here. Nathan's response was quiet and complete. He would not leave his wife on the mountain. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue logistics. He stated the only fact that still mattered to him, and his voice carried a finality that had nothing to do with climbing decisions. What Karsang could see and Nathan could no longer process was that Nathan's own body was failing alongside his wife's. 12 hours of climbing, declining saturation, frostbite pulling resources from his core, the emotional devastation of watching Sophie collapse. His decision to stay was both the choice of a man who loved his wife and the symptom of a brain without enough oxygen to evaluate alternative. He wanted to stay. He also could not have descended alone if he had tried. Both realities occupied the same body at the same time. He sat beside Sophie and leaned against her, placing an arm around her in a gesture that looked less like a decision and more like the last movement a body makes before it accepts that movement is over. Karsang and the assistant tried to move Sophie. They supported her between them and managed roughly 80 feet in 25 minutes, a pace that would require days to reach Camp 4, across terrain demanding independent. Sophie was dead weight, her legs completely unresponsive. Nathan followed the short distance they moved her, sat when they stopped, and did not respond to further instructions. His speech was gone. His coordination was gone. Karsang stood at 28,400 feet in building wind and faced the conclusion of every warning he had given, every number he had flagged, every recommendation heard and acknowledged and overridden. He had set the turnaround time. He had urged them off the summit. He had switched oxygen and physically attempted to drag Sophie downward. None of it had been enough, because the decisions that mattered were made before the climb started. In the radio call, where 61% became a gray zone rather than a red line. In the 25 minutes on the summit, where one more photograph always seemed worth 30 more seconds. They clipped Nathan and Sophie's tethers securely to the fixed line, verified oxygen flow on both masks, positioned them in a slight depression where wind exposure was marginally reduced, checked harnesses, carabiner gates, mask seals, everything that could be done without the ability to carry two people down a mountain at 28,000 feet. Then they descended. The last time Karsang looked back, they were sitting together in the snow, Nathan's arms still around Sophie, both figures motionless as spindrift erased the tracks around them, and the mountain absorbed them into its silence. Nathan and Sophie Keller were reported missing when they failed to return to Camp 4 by late afternoon on May 22nd. Over the following days, Sherpas descending from the upper mountain confirmed both bodies near the fixed line at approximately 28,400 feet, close together, with Nathan still positioned against Sophie. Sophie's oxygen was empty. Nathan's bottle had residual pressure, but the mask had shifted from his face, likely after he lost consciousness. During Karsang's own descent from the death zone that same day, exhausted, hypothermic, and carrying the weight of what had happened above him, he lost footing on a glazed section of the Lhasa face where fatigue turned a routine step into a fall. He slammed into hard blue ice and suffered a severe ligament tear in his right knee, along with a hairline fracture in his lower leg. Surgery in Kathmandu stabilized the joint, but could not restore it. The injury ended his high-altitude career after 14 seasons, and a safety record that had been, until that morning, without a single client fatality. He returned to Tem and helped manage a trekking lodge his brother-in-law operated. Nathan's camera was recovered during a partial body recovery attempt several days later. The last image on the memory card was slightly blurred from wind and shaking hand. Two figures on the summit of Everest, goggles pushed up, faces visible for the first and last time at that altitude, prayer flags just barely in the frame behind them. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.